Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered who was the first ever person to be Magnus Carlsen? Well, today we're going to be taking a look at that very exact game that was played in 2009 when Magnus Carlsen was only 9 years old. His opponent, Stefan, whose last name I dare not pronounce, was 14 years old. At this time, they were both unrated, and this was Magnus Carlsen's first ever game in the tournament, matter of fact. So in the database, this is his first ever recorded loss. His opponent, Stefan, is somewhat of a mystery. He's played only 18 games in the database, and he got to about a 1700 rating, which is pretty good. And he's played 4 games against Magnus, in which this is the only one that he's been able to beat him in. The purpose of this video is going to be analyze this game, see what could have went better for both players, and hopefully bring you guys some entertainment and informative value. Let's get started. So Magnus Carlsen here is with the white pieces, his opponent is with the black pieces. We open up with d4 and we get an England gambit. So Magnus takes, knight f6, bishop f4, normal stuff, and f6. Now usually how the England gambit goes is queen e7, followed by knight f3. The queen slides out to b4 and gives this check, forking the bishop and king. Bishop slides back, queen takes pawn, knight e3, bishop b4, rook b1, queen a3, knight d5 or knight b5. And white is significantly better here. I mean, the piece placement for white is much better. This knight is ready to jump into c7 at any given moment. This queen is super passive and very easy to trap, actually. And yeah, no, at this point, this is just a great position for white. It's one of the main reasons that the England gambit isn't played anywhere between above, let's say, 1500. And sometimes maybe a little bit higher if it's some faster time controls like bullet. But yeah, the England gambit is simply ineffective at this level. Now, what was played in the game was f6, so we didn't get to see this particular move order, but we got f6, which simply sacrifices a pawn. So 4 moves in, and white's just up a pawn. Now we can notice that this queen is now attacking the Magnus's bishop and this b2 pawn. And so if you are in this position as white, your best move is queen c1, simply protecting this bishop and the b2 pawn. Or if you want to be a little bit more passive but safe, you can just drop this bishop back to c1. And now you're just up a pawn. Yes, you're underdeveloped, but this is still a good position for white. Instead of that, Magnus Carlsen here, at the age of 9 years old, plays queen d2. Yes, protects the bishop, but sacrifices this b2 pawn, and ultimately will lose this rook. Magnus gives this queen e3 check, and now his opponent makes a horrendous mistake with knight ge7, which is seemingly a natural move, but it actually allows queen to c3, which kind of brings the game closer to equal. Slightly better for black, but still very playable. Why is knight ge7 so bad? Well, if we take a look at what would have happened if the bishop blocked, for example, queen c3 here is no longer possible because now bishop b4 comes out, pins the queen to the king, and simply wins this queen, right? This queen cannot capture because the bishop. And so what we see here with the knight blocking is that this bishop is no longer able to come out to b4, and so this allows the queen to jump in and slide to c3. Now this bishop b4 maneuver is super popular in the England gambit. This is something you'll see in any main line of the England, and so if you're an England player, you'll be familiar with this idea. But anyway, we did not get queen c3, unfortunately, from Magnus, as he plays bishop e5, which is an interesting idea to attack the queen and protect the rook, but unfortunately it also blunders this bishop. So this knight could simply take, and then this rook would still be hanging, and there would be simply nothing that Magnus could do, and this game would be easily resignable, right? Not quite. His opponent, instead of taking the free bishop, decides to take the free pawn instead by playing queen c2. Now this is a bad move for multiple reasons. First of all, black does not capitalize on the piece that was free for the taking, but also the queen no longer pressures this rook, and this gives white quite enough time to basically escape. Bishop takes c7 is played, taking the free pawn, and we get knight b4. Knight b4 is a very slow move in the sense that it really doesn't achieve much. Yes, it does target the c2 fork, but is it going to happen? Probably not, because there's a queen on c7, and also we can notice that this queen now attacks this bishop, but a simple knight c3, which was played by Magnus, prevents both of these ideas. After knight c3, we get knight a6. Now this is just a bad move because basically we rerouted the knight from c6 to b4 to a6. It's on the rim, on the edge of the board. It really is just a one-move threat. This bishop could honestly just go to f4, and this would be a great position for white. You get rook c1 from Magnus, though, which is an even better move. This attacks the queen with tempo, forcing the queen to go to b1, or sorry, b2. Now, if the queen went to g6, for example, this would have been very bad, because then knight b5 was a possibility, in which case this threatens knight d6, which would force a sacrifice of the queen, because if we notice that, if let's say a random move was played, Knight d6 here, this king has no moves. It cannot go here because of the bishop, and it cannot escape through f7 because of this knight, meaning that the only thing that black can do is sacrifice the queen. So queen g6 would have been a poor option. The best move here for black in case of this situation happening is to actually just take this bishop and then, sacrifice a rook. Obviously not preferable. So we get queen b2. Could have played rook b1 actually and just continued harassing the queen, but and then just brought this bishop back to f4. We would have been in a great position as well. So both options are very viable for white. Now instead, Magnus decides to play the move queen e5. Queen e5 not only doesn't achieve either of those things, but it also sacrifices the rook. Now you can't blame 9-year-old Magnus Carlsen, who just recently started playing the game, and this is his very, very first tournament game. But what really happened is that he seemingly just forgot that the queen was the only protector of the rook, and so by moving the queen, the rook is no longer protected. I think a lot of blunders from beginner to intermediate levels stem from this same kind of concept of forgetting that a piece was, no longer protected. And so it's important that you always keep in track and keep kind of mental notes as to what pieces need protection, which ones are protected, and what changes by moving a piece. The opponent spots this and takes the free rook, and now the only move that stops the game from being checkmate is knight to d1. Then Magnus's opponent takes the free bishop. So now Magnus is down both a rook and a bishop. When you're down material, it is generally advised in like 99% of the time to avoid trading pieces, because now all you can really do is play for counterplay, try to find some sort of attack, create some sort of ideas that will allow you to compensate for the lost material. So it's very important for Magnus in this position to avoid trading pieces. We get e4, good developing move. King slides out to d8. The point of that is to allow this knight to move to g6, as we will see later on. Knight jumps out to f3, and now knight g6. Now, like I just said, it's important to not trade material. So in this situation, a better move would have been queen a5, queen f5, things like that. However, Magnus Carlsen decided to play queen g5, which is seemingly a good check, but it also allows a queen trade, by which Magnus Carlsen's counterplay is basically diminished. There's really very little that Magnus at this position can do to try and sway the game into his own favor. So we get into this position, bishop check, king slides out. Now this bishop can no longer develop. And we continue with knight f4 check, king slides out. Knight f4 check was probably not the best move because it allowed the king to move out. This is what the king wanted to do anyway, to allow this bishop to get freed up. Rook f8 is played, which is the only move that really keeps the game in such dominant fashion for black. If, let's say, something like, I don't know, d6 was played, knight f7 check would have been a very strong move, and still it would be obviously losing for white, but it wouldn't be as bad. So rook f8 stops this idea of knight f7 check. It also prevents this knight from being captured. But then we get knight takes h7, so now attacking the rook. Now seemingly, Magnus's opponent forgets about this and plays the discovered check on knight d5. Yes, the rook attacks the king, and it is a discovered check. It's a cool move, but you also lose a rook. And so after this exchange, Magnus is only down one piece. He's no longer down a rook in a piece. He's just reclaimed his rook. Now this is still a terrible position, keep in mind, because black's pieces are simply better. This is basically an endgame, and black is just up an entire piece. And so this position is still basically lost. Knight takes d5, bishop c4, good move, knight slides back. Here, I think bishop b3 would have been more reasonable, because the bishop on d5 really doesn't attack much, but like I said, no criticism to either of those players. This is like their first ever tournament, both unrated. Magnus here, 9 years old. So you can't really blame them from playing these specific moves. I'm just trying to provide some educational value in the sense that certain moves would have played out better than other ones. a6, bishop slides down to d3. And from here, some pieces get shuffled around. We get into this position where this knight attacks this pawn and bishop. Bishop slides out to g6. Now this is a clever move because if this pawn capture was to occur, this rook could go into e8, force this king out of here and take this bishop, and now the material balance would be close to restored, and White would welcome some counterplay back into his game. Now his opponent Stefan spots that, and before he can capture this pawn, he slides the king out of danger, so this move is no longer viable. Rook e5, we get some pieces shuffling around. Magnus loses a couple of pawns, gives a check, knight develops, and now rook c5. Now this isn't a great square for this rook. Very, very limited in terms of where it can actually move. And after bishop b7, which is a clever pin, Magnus had to find the move bishop f7. Bishop f7 protects this knight and adds an additional layer of protection. This was necessary because what Magnus played was bishop f5, not f7, which allowed bishop d6 to be played. Now what we can notice is that the only protector of this knight is this rook, right? So we can notice that this rook cannot stay on this rank and has to move somewhere else on the file, meaning that this knight will no longer be protected. And after rook c2, which seemingly resolves the issue because after the bishop captures, you can simply take this knight. Not quite, because the bishop captures with check and also protects his knight at the same time. And so we keep going, and now Magnus is just down 2 pieces. There's really nothing he can do here, and all that's left for black is to convert. So how do you convert this position? Well, you start pushing your pawns. So that's exactly what black does. Now, unfortunately, not in the most accurate fashion. Black ends up losing a couple of pawns, so there isn't really a great example to show here. But he does get this passed pawn down to a3, rook a2, the rook gives us check, and now the king slides down to d3, which unfortunately welcomes this fork. So Magnus Carlsen's rook gets forked, and at this point, there's really not much he can do. He gets checkmated in beautiful fashion with bishop f6. Very nice checkmate here. The king cannot slide out to b1 because of the pawn, and cannot go anywhere on the second rank because of this rook. Now let's quickly take a look at what would have happened if Magnus didn't get his rook and king forked. For example, here, knight b4 is still a great option. Sending the rook to a1. At this point, you can just push this pawn, and then bishop f6 would have came, and pretty much the same tactic would have been employed. And this rook would have been lost. We gotta had a promotion, and simply white's king would have been checkmated very, very quickly. Overall, this was a very interesting game. There's quite a lot to learn from this, especially if you're a beginner to intermediate player. And this really goes to show that Magnus is also human, just like any other grandmaster. They all started somewhere. They were not good at some point, and it took a lot of years of practice and dedication to get to the level that they are at now. So ladies and gentlemen, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.